My brother married my fiancée after lying that I cheated. Mom said, she was never meant for you anyway. I disappeared without a word. 3 years later, I pulled up to the family reunion in a $420,000 car, while they showed up late because their old junker broke down 4 blocks away. I, 29M, stood at the altar 3 years ago, watching the woman I thought I'd spend my life with walk toward me in white. Except she wasn't walking toward me. She was walking toward my brother. That day never came for me. 6 months before our wedding, everything fell apart in a way I still don't fully understand. My fiancée called off our engagement after my brother told her I'd been cheating with someone from work. The accusation came out of nowhere. I'd never been unfaithful, never even looked at another woman that way. But somehow, my brother had manufactured evidence. Text messages that looked like mine, photos taken from angles that made innocent moments look damning. He'd doctored everything with enough skill that even I had trouble proving they were fake. When I tried to defend myself, my fiancée wouldn't listen. She'd already made up her mind. My brother had gotten to her first, spent weeks poisoning her against me while I was traveling for work. By the time I came home to explain, she'd already moved her things out of our apartment. She told me she couldn't trust me anymore, that my brother had opened her eyes to who I really was. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife could. I went to my parents' house that same night, desperate for support. I needed someone to believe me, to see through my brother's lies. My mother listened to my side of the story with a blank expression, her arms crossed over her chest. When I finished, she looked at me for a long moment before speaking. She said my fiancée was never meant for me anyway, that if she could be turned against me so easily, then maybe it was for the best. My father just nodded along, saying my brother wouldn't do something like that without reason. The words hit me like a physical blow. My own parents were choosing to believe my brother over me without even questioning his story. I realized then that I'd always been the outsider in my own family. My brother had been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, the one they'd always favored. I was just the spare, the one they tolerated but never truly valued. I left their house that night and didn't look back. Within a week, I'd packed up my apartment and moved across the country. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I changed my phone number, deleted my social media accounts, and cut off every connection to my old life. If they wanted to believe I was the villain in this story, then I'd let them. I was done trying to prove my innocence to people who'd already decided I was guilty. The first few months were brutal. I threw myself into my work as a software engineer, taking on every project and overtime hour I could get. The pain of the betrayal still burned in my chest, but I channeled it into something productive. I started developing an app in my spare time, something I'd been thinking about for years but never had the courage to pursue. Without the distraction of planning a wedding or trying to maintain family relationships, I had nothing but time. The app took off faster than I ever imagined. Within 8 months, it had caught the attention of investors who saw its potential. They offered me funding to expand, and I accepted. I worked 18-hour days, barely sleeping, barely eating, driven by a need to prove to myself that I was worth something even if my family didn't think so. The app grew exponentially, and within 2 years, I'd sold it to a major tech company for an amount of money that still didn't feel real. I wasn't a millionaire in the traditional sense, but I was comfortable. More than comfortable. I bought myself a Rolls-Royce Cullinan, a car I'd dreamed about since I was a kid reading car magazines. The price tag was ridiculous, but I didn't care. It was a symbol of everything I'd built on my own, without anyone's help or approval. Every time I looked at it, I remembered where I'd come from and how far I'd traveled. Then, 2 months ago, I got an email. It was from my cousin, the only family member whose contact information I hadn't changed. She'd somehow found my new email address and sent me a message about the annual family reunion. She said everyone missed me, that it had been too long, and that I should come home for the weekend gathering. She mentioned my brother and his wife would be there, along with my parents and the rest of the extended family. I stared at that email for hours. Part of me wanted to delete it and forget it ever arrived. But another part, the part that still felt the sting of their rejection, wanted them to see what I'd become without them. I wanted them to know that I'd survived their betrayal and come out stronger. So I replied with a simple confirmation. I'd be there. I didn't tell anyone about the car. I didn't mention my success or the company I'd built. I just said I'd attend and left it at that. In the weeks leading up to the reunion, I found myself rehearsing what I'd say if anyone asked where I'd been. But mostly, I imagined the look on my brother's face when he realized I hadn't fallen apart the way he probably hoped I would. The reunion was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at a park pavilion my family had rented for decades. I timed my arrival for exactly noon, when I knew everyone would already be there. I pulled into the parking lot in the Cullinan, the black paint gleaming in the summer sun. The car drew immediate attention from people walking past, their heads turning to see who was driving such an expensive vehicle. I parked in a spot near the pavilion and sat in the car for a moment, gathering my thoughts. Through the windshield, I could see my family gathered under the shelter. They were setting up tables and arranging food, everyone moving around in the familiar chaos of a family gathering. I didn't see my brother or my parents yet, but I knew they'd arrive soon. I stepped out of the car and locked it, the quiet beep of the alarm drawing more curious glances. I wore simple clothes, jeans and a button-down shirt, nothing flashy. I wanted the car to speak for itself. As I walked toward the pavilion, I saw my cousin spot me first. Her face lit up with recognition, and she rushed over to greet me. She said she was so glad I came, that everyone had been wondering about me. I gave her a brief hug and told her it was good to see familiar faces again. Other relatives started noticing me, and soon I was surrounded by aunts and uncles asking where I'd been and what I'd been up to. I kept my answers vague, mentioning I'd moved for work and had been busy with a new career. Nobody asked about the car yet, though I could see people glancing toward the parking lot with obvious curiosity. Then my brother arrived, and the energy shifted. I saw his beat-up sedan pull into the lot, the same car he'd been driving for over a decade. It sputtered and coughed as he parked it far from my Cullinan. He got out with his wife, my former fiancée, and they started walking toward the pavilion. They were arguing about something, their body language tense and frustrated. When they got closer, my brother looked up and saw me. The recognition hit him like a punch. His face went pale, then red, and I watched him process the fact that I was actually there after 3 years of silence. His wife noticed me a moment later, and her expression was harder to read. Surprise, definitely, but also something that looked like regret. My parents arrived minutes later, their old pickup truck making concerning noises as it pulled into the lot. My father had to coax it into a parking spot, and I could hear my mother complaining about needing to get it fixed. They walked toward the pavilion together, not noticing me at first because they were too busy discussing the truck's problems. My cousin pulled me aside and asked what I'd been driving. She'd seen me get out of the Cullinan and wanted to know if it was really mine. I confirmed it was, and her eyes went wide. She asked how I could afford something like that, and I told her about the app and the sale. Word spread quickly through the family. Within minutes, everyone knew about my success, and the whispers started. My brother approached me first. He asked where I'd been all this time, trying to sound casual, but failing to hide the edge in his voice. I told him I'd been building a life for myself, that I'd needed distance from everything that happened. He tried to play it off like the past didn't matter, saying we were family and families forgive each other. I looked at him directly and reminded him that he'd lied about me cheating, that he'd destroyed my relationship and my reputation without a second thought. His wife stood behind him, and for the first time, she spoke to me. She said she'd eventually learned the truth about his lies, that she'd figured out the evidence was fabricated about a year into their marriage. My stomach dropped. She'd known the truth and still stayed with him. She tried to explain that by the time she realized what happened, they were already married and she felt trapped. She said she'd wanted to reach out to apologize, but didn't know how to find me. I told her I wasn't interested in apologies that came 3 years too late. The damage was done, and I'd moved on. She looked hurt, but I didn't have any sympathy left for her. She'd made her choice when she believed my brother over me without giving me a fair chance to defend myself. My mother finally noticed the commotion and walked over. She asked what everyone was talking about, and someone pointed out my car. My mother looked at the Cullinan, then back at me, her expression shifting from confusion to something like awe. She asked if that was really mine, and I confirmed it was. She wanted to know what I'd been doing to afford something like that. I gave her the brief version, the app, the sale, the success I'd built from scratch. She tried to act happy for me, saying she always knew I'd do well for myself. The hypocrisy was staggering. I reminded her of what she'd said 3 years ago, about how my fiancé was never meant for me anyway. I asked her if she remembered telling me that my brother wouldn't lie without reason. She looked uncomfortable, trying to backtrack and claim she'd just been trying to help me move on. I told her the truth. that her words had shown me exactly where I stood in the family hierarchy, and that I'd spent 3 years proving I didn't need any of them to succeed. The silence that followed was deafening. My father tried to mediate, saying we were all family and needed to stick together. I asked him where that sentiment was when I needed someone to believe me 3 years ago. He didn't have an answer. The tension was thick enough to cut, and other family members started drifting away to give us space. My brother finally admitted he'd lied about everything. He said he'd been jealous of my relationship, that he'd always wanted my fiancée for himself and saw an opportunity to take her. He tried to justify it by claiming he'd fallen in love with her and couldn't help himself. His wife looked shocked by his candid admission, and I realized she probably hadn't known the full extent of his manipulation. I told him I didn't care about his reasons anymore. He'd made his choice, and I'd made mine. I'd disappeared because staying would have destroyed me, and leaving had given me the chance to build something real. The success I'd achieved wasn't about proving anything to them. It was about proving something to myself. My mother tried again to salvage the conversation, asking if we could start over and rebuild our relationship. I looked at her, then at my father, then at my brother and his wife. These people had abandoned me when I needed them most, had chosen convenience over truth, and had let me walk away without a fight. Now they wanted back in because I'd become successful. I told them I'd come to the reunion to show myself that I'd survived their betrayal, not to reconcile. Seeing them struggle with their old broken-down vehicles while I drove something that represented everything I'd accomplished without their support was enough closure for me. I didn't need their approval anymore, and I didn't need their presence in my life. Update 1. The reunion continued after that confrontation, but the atmosphere had shifted completely. My extended family, cousins, aunts, uncles, kept approaching me throughout the afternoon. They wanted to hear about my success, about the app I'd developed, and how I'd gone from a software engineer to selling a company. I answered their questions politely, but kept the details vague. The truth was, I didn't owe anyone an explanation for my absence or my success. My brother and his wife kept their distance after our initial conversation. I caught them arguing near the food tables several times, their voices low but their gestures animated. She looked angry, gesturing emphatically while he tried to calm her down. I suspected she was finally processing the full weight of what he'd done, not just to me, but to her as well. She'd built her marriage on a foundation of lies, and now that foundation was crumbling. My parents made several more attempts to engage with me. My mother brought me a plate of food, acting as if everything was normal, as if 3 years of silence could be erased with potato salad and small talk. She asked about where I was living now, whether I was seeing anyone, if I was happy. I gave her short, polite answers that revealed nothing meaningful. I lived in a different state. I wasn't seeing anyone seriously. Yes, I was happy. My father took a different approach. He pulled me aside near the parking lot, away from the crowd, and tried to have a man-to-man conversation. He said he understood why I'd left, and that he didn't blame me for being angry. But family was family, and at some point, I needed to forgive and move forward. He said holding on to anger would only hurt me in the long run. I asked him if he'd ever considered what it felt like to have your own father refuse to believe you when you were telling the truth. He looked uncomfortable, but insisted he'd just been trying to keep the peace, that taking sides would have torn the family apart. I pointed out that the family had already been torn apart the moment they chose my brother over me. His attempt at neutrality had been a choice, just not the one he wanted to admit. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself watching my brother more closely. He looked tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. His clothes were worn, his shoes scuffed and old. When he thought no one was looking, he'd stare off into the distance with an expression that might have been regret. His wife barely looked at him anymore, staying on the opposite side of the pavilion whenever possible. My cousin found me again and asked if I was planning to stay in touch this time. She'd always been kind to me growing up, and I didn't want to punish her for the sins of my immediate family. I told her I'd think about it, that reconnecting would take time and wouldn't happen overnight. She understood and gave me her updated contact information, making me promise to at least send her a message occasionally. As the reunion started winding down, my mother made one final attempt to bridge the gap between us. She approached me with tears in her eyes and said she was sorry for not believing me 3 years ago. She claimed she'd been scared of losing both her sons and had handled the situation poorly. She asked if there was any way I could forgive her and give her a chance to be part of my life again. I looked at her for a long moment, processing her words. Part of me, the part that still remembered being her son, wanted to accept the apology and move forward. But the larger part, the part that had survived 3 years alone and built something meaningful from nothing, knew better. Forgiveness wasn't something I could offer just because she was finally ready to ask for it. I told her I appreciated the apology, but trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt with a single conversation. If she genuinely wanted to repair our relationship, it would take time and consistent effort. I wasn't going to make any promises about the future, but I wouldn't completely close the door either. She'd have to prove through actions, not words, that she'd changed. Before I left, my brother approached me one more time. He looked defeated, his shoulders slumped and his voice quiet. He said he knew I'd never forgive him and that he didn't deserve forgiveness anyway. He'd destroyed my life because of jealousy and selfishness, and he'd have to live with that guilt forever. His marriage was falling apart because his wife now knew the full extent of his lies, and he had no one to blame but himself. He asked if I'd at least acknowledge that we were brothers, even if we'd never have a real relationship again. I told him we shared DNA, but that didn't make us family in any meaningful sense. Family was supposed to support you, believe in you, and have your back when things got hard. He'd done the opposite, and that couldn't be undone. Update 2. I drove away from the reunion as the sun started setting, the Cullinan handling the road with the smooth confidence that only a car of that caliber could manage. In my rearview mirror, I could see my family packing up the pavilion, moving around like ants in the fading light. I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me, not because I'd gotten revenge or proven them wrong, but because I'd finally confronted the ghosts of my past and realized they had no power over me anymore. The following weeks brought unexpected developments. My cousin reached out through email, keeping her promise to stay in touch. She told me that my brother's marriage was indeed falling apart. His wife had moved back with her parents temporarily, saying she needed space to think about whether she wanted to stay married to someone who'd built their entire relationship on manipulation and lies. My brother had apparently become withdrawn and depressed, barely functioning at his job. My mother also reached out, sending me a long letter through my cousin since she didn't have my direct address. The letter was full of apologies and regrets, explaining how she'd realized over the past 3 years that she'd failed me as a parent. She described how the house had felt empty without me, how holidays weren't the same, and how she'd often wondered if I was safe and happy. She wanted another chance to be in my life, even if it was just occasional phone calls or emails. I didn't respond immediately. The letter sat on my desk for days while I processed my feelings. Eventually, I sent her a brief email through my cousin, acknowledging receipt of the letter and saying I needed more time to think about what level of contact I was comfortable with. I wasn't ready to let her back in fully, but I also recognized that she was at least trying to make amends. My father never reached out directly, which didn't surprise me. He'd never been one for emotional conversations or admitting when he was wrong. According to my cousin, he'd been defending his past actions to other family members, insisting he'd done what he thought was right at the time. Some things never changed. The most surprising development came from my ex-fiancée. She somehow obtained my email address, probably from my cousin, and sent me a message. She wrote that she'd been living with guilt for years, knowing she'd married my brother based on lies, but feeling too ashamed and trapped to do anything about it. She'd finally worked up the courage to leave him and wanted to apologize for not believing me 3 years ago. Her message went on for several paragraphs, detailing how she'd discovered the truth bit by bit over the months following their marriage. She'd found inconsistencies in his story, noticed him being evasive about certain details, and eventually confronted him. He'd admitted to fabricating the evidence, but convinced her that it was too late to do anything about it. They were already married, I was gone, and revealing the truth would only cause more pain for everyone involved. She said she'd been weak and had taken the path of least resistance, but she regretted it every day. She wasn't asking for forgiveness or trying to get back together. She just wanted me to know that she was sorry and that she knew I deserved better than what she'd given me. She hoped I'd found happiness and peace in my new life. I read her email multiple times, feeling a complicated mix of emotions. Anger, because she'd known the truth and stayed silent. Sadness, because the relationship I'd thought we had turned out to be so fragile. But mostly, I felt nothing. The person I'd been 3 years ago had loved her desperately, but I wasn't that person anymore. She was a character from a past life, someone I'd once known but no longer had any connection to. I replied briefly, thanking her for the apology and acknowledging that it took courage to send it. I told her I hoped she found whatever she was looking for in life, but that I'd moved on and didn't have any interest in maintaining contact. It was a clean break, the kind of closure I hadn't gotten 3 years ago. My business continued to thrive. I'd started consulting for other tech startups after selling my app, using my experience to help them avoid common pitfalls and scale successfully. The work was fulfilling and kept me busy, which I appreciated. I'd also started dating casually, nothing serious, but it felt good to connect with people who knew nothing about my past and judged me solely on who I was now.